Welcome into the Odson Audibles podcast. I'm Matt Prehm, Erik Skopil on the show as always, and today we're welcomed by National Recruiting Editor for 24/7 Sports, Brandon Huffman, who was down in Eugene for Saturday Night Live. We're going to talk a bunch of recruiting. Brandon, how's it going, man? How was that drive home?
Oh, the drive home was fantastic. Anytime you have a chance to make a quick little detour to the west over off Milton Drive in Beaverton, you make that drive and you won't complain one bit.
Correct. You get access to that place. You're a lucky man. Sounds like
The only thing that sucked is, after that you have to drive home still. And I decided to drive home at apparently the same time everybody else in the Pacific Northwest that was making the drive from Oregon to Seattle was making said drive. But you know what? I know that you guys are working with, collegiate sports, and I'm open to all NIL deals myself. I stopped at Lazy Days Brewing in Beaverton, former ex Nova, had some pizza and a refreshment before I headed home. So, Lazy Days hit me.
Some orange boxes and some coffee. It makes you hot. Makes you happy.
Yeah, it makes me hoppy. Ha ha
ha. Let's before we dive into what we saw on Saturday on the field. Let's kind of talk a little bit about how that could have been the last one, maybe.
Yeah.
The NCAA released some legislation that SNL and other camps in late July are going away. Just how do you feel like this is going to impact Oregon? How do you feel like schools are going to pivot? Because one thing we know about college coaches, they find loopholes, they know how to exploit them, and they'll find one in this next one.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what kind of impact this has on Oregon. They're one of the few that actually does a real camp during the month of July. Most schools are doing events. Brian Doan had a really good article a couple of weeks ago about all the events that go on in that July week. You have the Lash Bash, you have the barbecue at the Big House, or Florida was one of the first ones that did this under Urban Meyer. They did Friday Night Lights, and now Saturday Night Live. It's been really like the best collection of talent at an event from a camp perspective in the month of July, and so that was one of the things that Oregon definitely had. And we talked about this the other night, guys, is that not only did Oregon get those players there, but they got them to work out. And the 26s that were committed, Brandon Lockhart, Chris Henry Jr., some of the guys that the 25s, the DeCorian Moores of the world. There's nothing for them to gain by camping this close to their fall camp starting, but they were there. And so losing that is certainly going to impact Oregon. And, it makes you wonder, will they pivot and do something that last week in the month of June? That's the same time the Future 50 is going on down in in Florida at IMG, where it's a lot of underclassmen. And that was the key. I mean, there were a lot of 25s there, but there was a good chunk of 2026s there. So it really is going to be interesting to see how this impacts Oregon, because they did have such a great event with elite talent from all over the country coming in.
And if this is the finale, what a send-off. I think Matt and I have been to basically everyone that they've done since Willie Taggart was here, 7 years ago. And you kind of touched on it, Huff. Like, they had a lot of five-star kids here. Most years, those guys just kind of sit in street clothes and watch. A lot of those guys participated. And I guess I just want your thoughts just kind of broadly on the camp. Like, I felt like, and you've been to, I don't know, a handful of these as well. Like, this felt like one of the more impressive showings just for getting these five-stars and top of guys to actually take part and do some stuff.
I was texting with Greg Biggins after the event, and just getting who's giving my perspective or getting my perspective from me on the event. And I said that this is the best collection of talent in the state of Oregon for a high school camp since the opening finals back in 2017, before it went, when it was still at the Nike campus, before it went down to Dallas. And honestly, this is the best collegiate camp from a talent standpoint that I've seen in an event since USC used to do their Rising Stars camp back when Pete Carroll was the head coach. And that was really the preeminent event back in the late 2000s before the opening finals. I mean, it wouldn't be unusual for them to do their 11 on 11 in t-shirt and shorts, no pads. And you'd have top, this is back in the days of scout.com. You'd have Scout 300 guys on the first 11 on offense, first 11 on defense, and Scout 300 guys that were backups at those events. So that gives you an insight, if you're just a casual fan, of what kind of talent this camp has attracted. But on Saturday, I mean, I think there were 6 players that were ranked number 1 at their position in the country. You had DeCorian Moore, you had Michael Terry, you had Trey McNutt, who are all the number 1 receiver, athlete, and safety, respectively, in this class. You had Kendry Harrison, who's the number 1 tight end of the country in 2026. You had Chris Henry Jr., who's the number 1 receiver in 2026. And I think maybe it was 5 number 1 players. Yeah. And then you had a number 2 player, Taran Ball, who's the number 2 running back. And then Brock Harris is the number 3 tight end. So, yes, but that's 7 guys that are in the top 50 in their respective class. That was just those. Oh, no. So it was number 1. Because Emmanuel Iheanacho was the number 1 tackle. So 6 number 1 players in their position, 2 others that were in the top 3 at their position, and 8 top 50 guys. And, I think the other thing that you look at is Chris Henry Jr. He could have been in Ohio State. Columbus. This was the 1-year anniversary. He committed on, I think it was July 28th, 2023 to Ohio State, and he spent the weekend at Oregon. So, yeah, what a way to go out. What a loaded group of talent. And that doesn't even take into account, guys like Jordan Davison, 4-star running backs that was there, didn't work out. Brandon Lockhart is a top 100 player at DB. Josiah Molden is, will be a top 100 guy in 2027. I mean, you had some 2028s that were there that had offers or were offered or will eventually be offered. I mean, it was 4 classes of absolute loaded talent. And again, I think the biggest kind of the eye opener to all of this is the national talent that came in. It wasn't just West Coast guys. It was national guys from all over the country. That tells you what the caliber of this event has become and Oregon's ability to attract them there.
Darion Ball committed to Oregon hours before the camp started, and we were able to watch him. And he wasn't the highest rated player on campus, but he felt like the best player that day. And I'm just kind of curious your thoughts on seeing him in person, seeing how he fits in today's day and age of football. He worked out at running back, and then I think what probably pushed him over the edge was all of a sudden we saw him at receiver, and it was like, oh my God, no one can cover him there either.
Right.
Yeah. And that's what was so impressive about him is that he's a natural running back. He's not a guy who's an all-purpose back who is going to be a slot receiver in college. He's a running back. Don't make no mistake about it. But the fact that he was so natural as a pass catcher and the way he looked in that route running makes him even more of a threat, more dangerous, because it shows that positional versatility. I mean, by all means, stay at running back, but we all know that the running back position has been devalued in the NFL. It's been devalued a little bit when it comes to, your draft slotting. Maybe receiver, which I think 5 first-round receivers are drafted this year, maybe 6. Maybe that is the move, and he showed that he could play that at a high level. I mean, you could see the frustration in the DB's eyes when they're covering it. A lot of running backs are stiff when they're running routes. They aren't necessarily natural pass catchers. They're used to the ball being tossed to them, put in their breadbasket. He looked like an elite pass catcher. And, I had talked to him a few months ago when he was selected to the Polynesian Bowl. This was my first time getting to see him in action. And, I mean, what a treat he was to watch. And I think, we said I thought he was the best performer there over the course of the beginning of the event to the end of the event. And that's what you want to see guys like that. Erik, I think I said to you at one point, like, there's about Ball. I'm like, man, whoever this kid is, he's pretty good. And I look down to Taran Ball. I'm like, I was like when the guys that you say look pretty good are the guys that are already thought of as being pretty good. It makes you feel like you're not crazy. But he was definitely catching a lot of attention from all of us on the sidelines, which, it has to make Rashad Samples, Dan Lanning pretty excited about what they've got coming in.
I just want to follow up with him, Brandon. Obviously the recruiting rankings are going to change a ton over the course of time, but coming out from I know it's one data point, and I'm sure Gabe Brooks has seen him a bunch down in Texas, and other people probably have more experience, probably have seen him more. But what do you think of what his ceiling is as a prospect from a rankings perspective? I know he's already a top 50 guy, as you said, the number 2 ranked running back, but could this be one of the rare 5-star running backs potentially?
I think, his trend meter is going to go up. Now, I say that knowing that a top 247 update, which I have not seen any of it, is coming out this week. So I don't know where he falls, but I would say based on, his size and skill set, but then also you look at what he did in track. You look at, a 10.5 number in the 100 as a sophomore, with two sub 23, 200 times, but the 10.5.1 as a sophomore. That's impressive. That's only going to trick up. And, I say that as a guy, we saw Rod Pleasant walking around the other night, the guy who, when you run a certain time, you're just like, man, are you going to get faster? Well, yeah, you get faster as you get older. And, what's his time going to be next spring? I doubt he runs his senior year. He'll probably already be on campus. But he's the guy that I think is going to continue to trend upward because those speed markers are absolutely impossible to ignore. Again, the issue will be a position that's been devalued, but that ability to catch the ball, that ability to be a game breaker probably offsets the positional value. Don't hold me to that. I'm not making no promises.
You heard it here first. Brandon Huffman says he'll be a 5-star. He's a 5-star.
Another guy that was impressive that wasn't the highest rated guy was Darion Seran, an athlete out of Vancouver, Washington, Evergreen High School, played with true freshman Oregon offensive lineman Fox Crater last season. Junior Adams offered him at a camp this summer, and it seemed like Junior Adams was just all over the place with Seran. Wherever he went, he was there. You were first to put in a crystal ball. What's the latest here? What's your thoughts on him as a receiver? 5'10", 160, but boy, he was a playmaker at a position that had 3 5-star receivers at the group.
It's funny because you see what a unicorn Chris Henry is from a size standpoint, from a skill standpoint, with his speed and his twitch. You see Darion Moore. Darion is a pretty unremarkable looking fellow when you're looking at him in the context of Darion Moore, Chris Henry Jr., but he was the one that you'd see Junior smiling after he'd run a route because he was so pristine in his route running. Now, he's not going to blow you away with the elite speed. He didn't have great markers at the Under Armour camp. He's a little bit on the skinnier side, a little bit on the slighter side. He's put on about a dozen pounds since the spring to get him up to 160. But there is a place in a lineup and in a roster and in a rotation for a guy who runs routes as cleanly and pure as he did, catches the ball as cleanly as he did. Is he going to be a human highlight reel? Probably not. Is he going to be a guy that you're going to get the ball to? Absolutely. Because he's going to catch it. He's going to get you some yards. He's going to make he's going to run the route and make the play. I would not be shocked if he's committed to Oregon in the next 7 to 10 days. I think that given the fact that he could have gone to Washington, where a couple of his 7-on-7 teammates were, one of them's already committed there, in Ansu Sano, who plays at Lake Ridge High School in Lake Oswego, Elijah Durr, another kid that's got an Oregon offer and a Washington offer. He was at Washington. Seran could have gone to Washington, but he went to Oregon. And I think that shows you kind of where he's prioritizing. And I wouldn't be shocked if his commitment comes sooner rather than later. And he's absolutely a take. Again, you need a guy like him. He's not going to necessarily have all those draftable measurements and draftable times, but he's a guy that brings extreme depth and talent to the receiver room. And I thought that at a star-studded field at receiver, he was a guy that if you're talking the top performers at receiver there, he's in that conversation for the top of from the jump.
It's probably obvious, but this camp has a couple things for Oregon staff. It's an opportunity to get 5 stars on campus, but it's also an evaluation period. And Oregon came out of this event, I think, offering about half a dozen prospects. And I want to just focus on one of them because it's a 2025 linebacker, which means it's somebody that could sign with Oregon at the end of this year. And that's McKay Madsen, a linebacker who's, I think, a 2-sport athlete. We were talking about him a little bit on Saturday. I want to get your kind of sense of maybe his recruitment, his skill set, and maybe why you think Oregon wound up kind of throwing a dart out here.
Yeah, I mean, what makes him so intriguing is the positional versatility. I mean, he's got an offer from UCLA as a running back. He's like more of an H-back. BYU offered him as an athlete. Oregon offered him as a linebacker. And he's kind of a throwback, an old school jack of all trades, could play a number of positions, but he's also a state champion in the shot put and discus. He threw, I think, 63 feet in the shot put this year. And track is certainly something that he wants to entertain in college. And if you think back to just 6-7 months ago, Oregon signed another state champion thrower in Braden Platt, who was another jack of all trades. He was a state player of the year as a running back, even though he was going to play linebacker in college. And McKay Madsen had even better numbers than he did as a thrower. The thing that may have an impact on his recruitment is the fact that he's planning to serve his LDS mission for the next 2 years before he enrolls in campus. Well, there was a guy named Gatlin Baird who signed in 2024, who was an elite track guy himself, who's also serving an LDS mission. Now, Gatlin said, track was unlikely. The closer he got to taking his mission, the more, and not running track this spring, the more he said, well, maybe I will do track in college. Well, they don't call it Track 10 USA for nothing. So I think that's something that's kind of the ace in the hole for Oregon. And I think a reason why they offered him is because, hey, from a numbers standpoint, granted, this year's class will be the first one where the numbers don't really mean anything, because next year with the roster numbers changing, he'll be gone for 2 years. They won't have to really count him if you were to sign with them until 2027. But you take a player like that. You take a guy who is a football player, a pure throwback football player that could play a number of positions, but that also has elite track numbers that he'd be a bonus to both programs. And I thought he acquitted himself nicely. And I think that, he came to that camp not just for the work, but to be evaluated for a potential offer. And, it was refreshing. I think he might have been the only 2025 player that was offered the other night, if my
correct.
Is right. So that should tell you that, Oregon has almost moved on exclusively to the 26 and 27 class. Well, they offered him because they know he's essentially a part of the 2027 class. But a guy that I think is absolutely an offer caliber player, and, a guy that I think his own rankings is going to shoot up this fall.
This is going to be a pretty open-ended, choose-your-own-adventure answer for yourself, Huff. We've talked about a bunch of guys that have gotten offers from Oregon or standouts or could be close to committing, but what else stood out to you? Because, like we said at the beginning, this was as loaded of a camp as we possibly could, and I feel like we'd be doing a disservice if we could make this podcast 2 hours long. It was so good.
Mm-hmm. But I could talk for 2 hours.
Yeah,
that's part of it.
What stood out beyond the guys that have gotten offered, or the guys that really truly dominated, like Ball and Seran?
Yeah, I think the defensive line group, we didn't get to see them in the one-on-ones because they're on the opposite side of the field, and there's a little bit of a wall of the players that are waiting for their reps. But when the defensive linemen came over to the south side of the stadium, the press box side of the stadium, to do some individual drills, it was a talented group. And it was really talented, especially in kind of the younger group. I mean, you had Richard Wesley, who will be in contention for the number one player in the country in 2027, who started as a freshman this past year at Sierra Canyon in Chatsworth. And I think Oregon fans will like to hear this. He has been compared quite favorably and quite consistently to another pass rusher that came from the San Fernando Valley and Kayvon Thibodeau. And I think that there's, kind of a history there in the sense that, he's very familiar with KT. He's watched him. He's known him. He obviously knows what he did at Oregon. They come from a very similar part of Southern California. And Oregon was one of the first schools to offer him. And he is a big-time prospect. He is, a guy that I'm very excited to see how he develops over the next 3 or 4 years, because, he's got a chance to be a top 5, top 3, potentially number 1 player in the country in his class, and probably a lot to be, top 2 or 3 in the state of California. And then you had Crew Jones, who was another one of the players that got an offer on Saturday night. And I've seen Crew a bunch. I mean, as an 8th grader last year, he was invited to the Under Armour camp in Salt Lake City, and he looked like a senior. And he was going into his freshman year in high school, double-digit offers already. Another elite pass rusher. Then you look at the 2026 group, you had Tom Topui from Mater Dei. You had Bob Mulatalu from Utah, another 4-star. You had Tank Carrington out of Bishop Gorman, another top 100 player. Anthony Jones from Southern California, another top 247 player. Then you had, Viliama Moala Bingham, who's another guy who's, potential top 247 guy down the line. Samote Katalanga, who is from J. Sarah, another player that, could be playing himself into the top 247. And that didn't even take into, count that we finally got to see Tony Cumberland at something. And, he made the move to Willamette High School from Arizona. This is his first event. Matthew Johnson, it was Willamette High School. That they've been so great at producing talent. And now they've got the number 1 player in the state of Oregon. You had Matthew Johnson there, who's a 2025, his first event of the spring or of the summer. So you almost forget that Cumberland and Johnson were there because there's all these other guys that are uncommitted that were there. So Tony Tuoti, Tosh Dupoy had to have been just, loving the talent that was there. So we saw it in the 2024 class with Aiden Breland and Elijah Rushing and Jericho Johnson. And Dan Lanning made it very clear when he got the job at Oregon, he wanted to bring an SEC approach to recruiting. And one of the biggest things to do that was in that front 7, but especially on the defensive line. And they had been hoarding defensive line talent, where to the fact like you could lose a Josiah Sharma and it doesn't really break your heart because there's so much other talent and there's so much young talent that's, chomping at the bit to play there. So I think that was what really stood out to me was just how good that defensive line group. And for a position that the West has really not had a ton of talent historically or depth of talent, there was a lot of West Coast flavor to those defensive linemen that were there.
Huff, I want to pick your brain on a position that I think is a pretty big need for Oregon in 25, but I also want to pick your brain on a couple of guys from 26, and that's tight end. 2 of the 3 top tight ends in the 26th class were here, Kendra Harrison and Brock Harris. What did you make of those 2 guys? And then since we were kind of meeting up there at Autzen on Saturday, Desan Brame decommitted from Oregon. I wonder if you had any thoughts on kind of that situation and maybe where they look following that, because they do need to find a tight end in this class.
Yeah, and I think, one thing that really helps with Oregon is that Brock Harris is originally from the state of Oregon. I think he was zoned to go to Westview High School. Don't know if he would have gone there. He may have gone to Jesuit, may have gone to Central Catholic. But he was zoned to play at Westview, so he's a Portland guy. He's in southern Utah now from the same area where Panay Sewell played his high school ball. Georgia is probably their toughest competition for him right now. And Georgia had a little bit of success with the West Coast tight end named Brock in the last couple of years. But the one thing that Georgia doesn't have in their favor is that he's not from Georgia. He is from Oregon originally. And the Ducks are going to be there in that top 2 all the way until the very end. Now, with Kendra Harrison, he's the number 1 tight end in the country. Now, I'll admit, I'm a little bit more of a fan of Brock as a pure tight end. I think he's more of an instant impact guy, but I think Kendra Harrison I understand he's a long-term guy. He's close to OJ Howard in that freakish talent, still maybe a little bit raw as a tight end, maybe not the natural pass catcher that Brock Harris is. The better pure receiver, I think, is Brock, but there's that athletic upside that Harrison has, which is obviously, pretty impressive and what you're looking for in a tight end if you're playing the long game there. He has a top 6 that, Oregon is kind of like the old Sesame Street thing. One of these is not like the other, and it's just because from a regional standpoint. He's got Florida State, Miami, you got Penn State and Tennessee, and then you got North Carolina where he's from in there. And then there's Oregon, the only school west of the Mississippi. So when you're in the top 6 for the number 1 tight end, Brock hasn't narrowed his list down to a smaller group, but the reality is Oregon's going to be on that very, 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 very short list. If they can get one of those 2, I think it'll, soften the blow of losing a tight end commitment in 25 and maybe offset their lack of a tight end in this class.
Sticking kind of with that, Oregon needs one in 2025. And the number 1 player in the state of Oregon, Barron Naon, is a tight end. He's currently committed to Washington. Strangely enough, Oregon's really never – I don't even think they've officially offered him a scholarship. They haven't. would it make sense? Do you anticipate Oregon at least circling back, or has Oregon waited so long that at this point he's not even interested?
Yeah, I think it may be a little bit of too little, too late there. But, also keep in mind, you've got Michael Terry, who they're on the short list for, who he's a little bit like Kenyon Sadiq was, where, with that size, he might be better suited as a tight end, maybe not a true inline tight end where you're going to put his hand on the dirt and he's going to be blocking defensive ends, but you're going to flex him out, use him as a pass catcher. You're going to use him in the passing game. And I think that Michael Terry could really fill that need as a tight end. It probably makes their efforts to get him that much greater now. There's probably a little bit more urgency in trying to land him. Nebraska, I think, was getting him on campus. Was it Tuesday or Wednesday this week before the dead period? So, they've got to kind of weather that. But I think that, that makes him that much more important to get, because I think he fulfills that need as a tight end because of his ability to play the position, being that flexed out guy.
I've got one more for you, and it's kind of separate from the SNL conversation. We're kind of moving into the just tossing things your way and let you answer portion of the show. I don't think we've talked to you on here about Demetri Manning, the offensive tackle, kind of right from your backyard up there in Bellevue. This guy, I remember seeing him actually for the first time at an SNL camp a couple of years ago and being like, this guy is ginormous, but I was wondering what the projection would be. And obviously for Oregon, the projection is good enough to make an offer and to accept a commitment. What are your thoughts on Demetri, who's a 2025 offensive line commit?
I'll tell you, you've got one of the biggest wingspans that you're going to find from anybody in this class. I think he's an 84-inch wing. He's got tremendous length. He comes from a factory of linemen. The thing with Demetri is he's so massive and so big. I think he ends up having to slide inside to play tackle. You'd think with that size, with that length, that friend, he'd be a natural tackle, but little bit, lacks a little bit of athleticism to be a true tackle. But I think he would be a absolutely outstanding guard, and another guy that I think very well could play his way into the top 247 this fall. Just want to see him get a little bit quicker, a little bit more agile. He's massive. He's strong. What's his school? Bellevue. They do the strong side, weak side. So he'll play on the right side. He'll play on the left side. The only hesitation with a guy like Demetri Manning is for every David DeCastro that has come from Bellevue, there's been a Henry Roberts or a Steve Schilling, guys that struggled in pass protection when they got to college because of the wing tee that Bellevue runs. Now, David DeCastro was an interior lineman who, let's be honest, when he was playing for Jim Harbaugh and David Shaw, Stanford wanted to run the ball up your, down your throat and up your tailpipe for the entire game. And so there wasn't necessarily a huge need for, pass protection. Whereas, DeCastro and Schilling, Roberts and Schilling struggled in pass protection. So that's the thing with me where I think he's better suited inside because that foot speed needs to continue to work on. He's not getting a lot of opportunity to do that at Bellevue. But he is an upside guy. As he continues to refine and reshape his body, which he's done a magnificent job of doing over the last 18 months, I think he's got a very high ceiling.
Last question for you. It doesn't really have to do anything with Oregon exactly, but the NCAA also decided to push scholarship limits across the board for sports up. Football goes to 105. What's your thoughts on this? It's good for players to get more money, more financial aid help. But my first reaction was the Oregons, the Ohio States, the Alabamas, the LSUs. The gap's only going to get wider because now they can add even more players to their rosters.
I look at a player like Jaden Fortier, and I think that you're going to see more guys kind of take that approach. And for folks that may wonder what that means, Jaden was offered by Oregon down the stretch last year, but it was kind of one of those, a few days for Sunday, but it was almost one of those like, hey, you're an in-state kid. It's not necessarily we're going to sign you. It's where you're going to have the NIL that's going to cover it. I think Hunter Haynes had a very similar offer as well, ended up signing with Washington State. When you're expanding the roster, you still need to understand that while the roster might be growing and the scholarship might become available, you still have a depth chart that you're going to have to climb your way up. And if you're a late offer guy, yeah, the offer might be there, the number might be there, but do you want to be the 25th guy, the 30th guy in that class? Whereas the other school you might have committed to, the school you might be leaning to, is bringing you in. They offered you months before. They want you as a higher rated player, on their board. I think back to, 2006, and Oregon fans will remember Kenny Rowe.
Yeah.
And I remember they offered Alfred Rowe, USC offered Alfred Rowe the day before signing day that would have been, 2005, 2006 class, one of those classes. I think he was committed to Washington State. They offered him and like one other guy at Long Beach Poly. They offered him late. Those guys became like the 24th and the 25th best players in USC's class out of 25 guys, never played it down. And they would have been, the standout commits at the schools that they were originally committed to had they stuck with it. That's where I think that, yes, the rich may get richer, but if you're a guy who wants to go and say a Georgia, an Alabama, an Oregon, an Ohio State offers you late because they have the numbers, are you really going to play? Is it about playing time or is it about the logo? Is it about, the locker room you get to be in, or is it about being on the field? And so that's the thing that I think people need to pump the brakes a little bit and thinking, oh, this is going to be that all 105 players are going to go to the 5 best schools. No, they're not. Some of these kids still want to play. And those schools are still going to have a little bit of a ceiling on NIL. So just because a school's got a good NIL program doesn't mean that they're going to be able to offer every kid X amount of dollars. Another school like a Missouri could still come in and say, hey, we're going to give these 5 best players good NIL deals and the opportunity to get on the field right away. So that's something that I don't think people are thinking enough of, that at the end of the day, guys still want to get on the field. And you may go to a school because the scholarship's available, but is the playing time available?
He's Brandon Huffman, works for 24/7 Sports. Read his stuff throughout the network on DuckTerritory.com. Huff, thanks for coming on the show. Look forward to the next one down the road.
Thanks for having me on, fellas.